G'day, welcome to the Green Left Show. Today we have an interview with David Shoebridge, Greens Senator for New South Wales, who is also the first Australian politician to visit the autonomous areas in northern Syria, popularly known as Rojava, or the Rojava Revolution. Before we get underway, I do want to acknowledge that this show is recorded on stolen First Nations land, always was, always will be Aboriginal land. Also, if you like the work that we do, please do become a Green Left supporter. It's the number one way to support our work and also to receive the content that we produce. I'm going to turn it over to Peter Boyle, who's conducted this interview. Take it away, Peter.
Thank you, David, for making time to speak to Green Left about your recent visit to North and East Syria, Rojava as it's known to the Kurds. But before you share your broader impressions from that visit, I believe it took quite a journey for you to get there. You can't just fly into Rojava as you can to most other well-inhabited places.
You don't just go to Flight Centre. But it took a significant amount of planning. Obviously, we've worked with the Kurdish community here, Kurdish members of the Greens, including one of our Inner West councillors, Ismet Taston. But we also made connections with the administration in northeast Syria, as well as some NGOs who we work regularly with. So that whole process of setting it up, ensuring that we'd be met at the border and that we would have a safe visit to northeast Syria took many months. And then once those arrangements were in place, we needed to get there. And as you point out, it's a bit of a journey. We flew from Sydney to Abu Dhabi, which takes some 14 hours. You have a layover in Abu Dhabi, then you fly into Erbil, which is in northwest Iraq. And then it's about a 3-hour drive from Erbil to the border crossing over the Tigris River into the Democratic Autonomous Administration of Northeast Syria. So, that it's roughly a 48-hour journey from Sydney to get there. And, the distance is real, but of course we weren't assisted in that journey by the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade either.
Did they try to dissuade you from making this visit?
Well, they actively sought to discourage us going to Syria at all, describing it as incredibly dangerous. Obviously, there's a smart traveller alert which says, it's a do not travel zone. We gave them our proposed itinerary months in advance and offered to meet and speak with them. Our office had a couple of meetings with DFAT. Their only interest in terms of our visit was would we be going to the desert detention camps where Australian women and kids are being held. It was pretty much the only interest they showed in our trip. And we indicated we would, and it would be part of our visit. Again, they said do not go. But they raised the heat, though, once we actually did leave. Because, off from the flight from Sydney to Dubai, that was overnight Sydney time, and my office was bombarded with messages from Foreign Affairs not long after we took off, saying there was an urgent need to speak to myself and my staff member, Sam Brennan, who was coming with me. They had urgent new advice about the security situation and they must raise them directly and urgently with us. So when we landed in Abu Dhabi, our burner phones, which the department had access to, were buzzing with messages and emails and notes for urgent contact with DFAT when we landed.
So the first city you got to in Rojava was commercially Ankara, the de facto capital.
Yeah.
And what were your impressions?
I should just finish the DFAT version. What happened with DFAT? Because we spoke to DFAT when we were in Abu Dhabi, and they said urgent new advice. We've changed the smart traveller warning. Specifically to say do not travel to northeast Syria. There'd previously been no mention about northeast Syria. They changed it that night, and they said that they changed it because of urgent national security evidence that they had been given about the security situation. We asked what that evidence was. They said they wouldn't tell us, couldn't tell us. National security can't tell you. We said, well, you've got our itinerary. Does it apply to any particular part? Is there any part of the country we should be more careful of? No, can't tell you, can't help you. But we want you to know that we think it's so important. We've raised this urgently with you now. We've changed the smart traveller warning. You can look on the website. We changed it today. I've got out of bed at midnight to make this call. All of this sort of danger. And we said, well, look, just tell us what the nature of the. Nope, we'll not tell you. And what they'd said there were persistent and ongoing threats in northeast Syria. And so I said to them, well, look, if your argument is it's persistent and ongoing, that doesn't sound like it's anything new. And, we've been talking with the administration, talking with NGOs. We think it's comfortable. And we indicated we would continue with the visit. We slightly changed the itinerary to not go to the far western part of northeast Syria, so as we were near an exit point in case something did happen to Iraq. But, we then, and in doing that, we spoke again to the NGOs on the ground. We checked with our Kurdish friends, and they all said no material change. It was as safe that day as it had been the day before. So we proceeded with the visit. We crossed the border, and do you know what, Peter? The day after we crossed the border, DFAT reversed all those changes on the Smart Traveller and removed them all the day after we crossed the border. So, I don't know, you make of that what you will.
Well, sadly, it probably is the first time there's been any official mention of North and East Syria in the DFAT website, I imagine, because that's a degree.
Yeah.
It's
I mean, they just don't want to see it. They don't want to know about it. So, yes, you're right. So our first, crossed the border. It's about then 3 hours over to, not quite, to Kamlishi at the right up almost on the border with Turkey, and we met with the foreign affairs officials from the administration, and that was the first time we really got a sense of what they were asking for and what their thoughts about the future should and would be. And they indicated that there's ongoing peace negotiations with the new regime in Damascus. That they have a goal for a pluralistic, a federalist kind of structure in Syria, where there's one Syria, but people's rights and identities are respected. And they spoke about being very concerned that the push from Damascus and perhaps some other outside forces was to simply have a one-colour Syria. And they were not. They thought that would be incredibly damaging and tear apart a lot of the gains they've had in northeast Syria. But they absolutely indicated they were committed to the peace process, committed to a future of Syria where everybody's rights were respected as a unified country, but where, autonomy and respect was also a core part of the future. In the course of that, they also spoke about, the fact that they were very glad that there'd been a cessation since about March of Turkey's bombing of infrastructure. And while Turkey hasn't removed its forces from northeast Syria, still, effectively in occupation of parts like Afrin and others, that temporary, hopefully permanent, ceasefire with Turkey was also important to allow the peace negotiations and a safe future to be negotiated. So it was a pretty. That was our first meeting, and we spoke through a number of those themes that were recurring throughout the course of it.
What were your general impressions of life in Kamishli? Like, how does it look to you? What does it strike you like? Is this a place at peace, or
well, I mean, it's all rebuilding from a really brutal civil war, and it's also faced some ongoing attacks from the Turkish military as well. But it is overwhelmingly, there's a sense of security and peace. There's economic life coming back, there's rebuilding happening, and there's a sense of life returning and economic life returning. Cities being rebuilt, infrastructure being rebuilt, but you can't ignore the scale of the damage. Like pretty much every power station in northeast Syria has been bombed and destroyed. Power for the bulk of the population remains intermittent. It's also dealing with a pretty brutal drought. So the country is very, very dry, and that's impacted a big part of the economy, the agricultural sector. And you can feel that too. You can feel the dust and the dry at the moment. And, I think everyone was, in their own way, praying for some rain, which would be welcome throughout the region.
Are the general, the streets, does it look like a very highly militarized place, or
Oh, well,
not?
no. I mean, there's almost, there are checkpoints like every 50 Ks or so along some of the highways, but they're very light. You know, there's, you slow down, and then, you know, 19 times out of 20, there's no stopping. You just move through checkpoints, and they're not heavily militarized, but there is a modest military presence at the checkpoints. But in terms of the cities and the, you know, outside of those checkpoints, there's almost no, well, very minimal military presence, no paramilitary presence. You know, it's very very low key, that part of it. You know, you would see more military on the street going for a walk in Guangzhou in China than you would going for a walk pretty much anywhere that I saw in northeast Syria.
Now, I understand you also visited Raqqa, which used to be the capital of Islamic State until it was liberated by the Kurdish-led Syrian Democratic Forces in 2017. What were your observations there? Is that would have been a city that would have to have been rebuilt quite a lot?
Well, I mean, Raqqa is still obviously suffering the very real brutal scars of the you know, that the occupation by ISIS and then the battle to defeat ISIS. Those scars remain. Again, there's rebuilding happening. Like you may well, you and some of the listeners may well be familiar that really in the centre of Raqqa there was a roundabout, a fairly notorious part where the scenes of extreme brutality played out from ISIS.
Executions
and people's opponents, and once they've been executed, their body parts have been put on display. And just down the road from that is a stadium, which was a notorious torture centre. So there were those parts of the city where there's a, you know, we're not talking forever ago, you know, we're only talking barely a decade ago, not even, where that kind of violence, obscene violence, and then the destruction that followed as ISIS was defeated and liberated. But, you know, we returned to that part of the city, for example, around that roundabout. There's now gardens and a sculpture. The buildings have been rebuilt around. None of that horror is visible. But, you know, the city still has the memory of it. And you can still see the impacts of civil war. We met with the Zanubian Women's Council in Raqqa, you know, one of a number of women's councils we met with. These extremely proud and strong women who represent, you know, all of the ethnic and religious makeup of Syria. Kurdish women, Syriac women, Arab and Yazidi, you know, all forming together to advance women's rights, to de-radicalise, and to do that really hard work in Raqqa. And it is hard work in Raqqa, and it's quite, obviously, sometimes quite frightening. They continue to get threats, particularly online threats. That's very real. And probably more real down in Raqqa, further south in the administration than it is further north. There is a, you know, a different population makeup down in Raqqa, which is very clearly a challenge for the administration to ensure that everybody feels a part of the administration, but they're endeavouring to do that as best they can. You know, and when you're in the Zenobian Women's headquarters and they've got their meeting hall, you know, the cost of the war is very clear because all around the wall are pictures of martyred women who died fighting to liberate or died in the course of the occupation. And that, you know, connection with those women, and, you know, some of the women in the council had been part of that struggle to liberate Raqqa. And, you know, that very real concern about what their future holds. And I do remember one of the co-chairs at the end of it said, you know, after talking us through all the challenges, the positivity, but, you know, the concerns they have about the near future of Syria, was, you know, in a moment that was, I think, brutally honest, said, I am not sure I will be here in 2 years' time. You know, this is very hard work. Yep.
I suppose Raqqa is a Arab majority city, I think, still. If there was a city that was going to be a test for the model of, pluralistic engagement through democratic confederalism in North and East Syria, it would be Raqqa.
It would be, and in fact, that's where we
Yes.
where we also met with the co-chairs of the Executive Council of the administration. And maybe your listeners and our viewers aren't fully aware of this, but all of those senior positions in the administration are co-chaired by a man and a woman. And between the co-chairs and the co-deputies, you see that spread of ethnicity and religion being represented in the regime. But, there really is a radical, I suppose, maybe from the near history of Syria, a sort of radical commitment to gender equality that's played out in the administration, and was played out in the fighting for the liberation of northeast Syria from ISIS and Daesh. So you really get that in each of the important meetings that we held, unless they were women-only councils. The key positions were co-chaired by a man and a woman. The key governing positions are shared across the plurality of the population. And, that's been implemented in Raqqa as well. But it is challenging. That's obviously the city that we visited, where you could see the challenges were most real. We had a higher degree of security in Raqqa. There was a definite clear uplift in the security that was provided to our delegation when we were in Raqqa from the rest of our trips through northeast Syria.
Now, you spoke about this, the gender equality. I think the people who fought on the side of the Rojava revolution and successfully defeated ISIS have claimed that this systematic empowerment of women is a kind of secret weapon of the revolution. It's a sort of ability to drive change, to enlist new forces, and to interact with community in a more complete way. Do you see any evidence of this?
Well, you super did, and you see, we went to a desert detention camp, El Roj, the following day. The perimeter security of that, and then the internal administration of that. The perimeter security, which is as much protecting the camp from the risk of outside attack as it is from maintaining the camp and people within the camp. That perimeter security was staffed almost entirely by women, by women who are part of the armed forces of northeast Syria. And you see women, to the extent that you will see military, and it's not unusual to see women as part of the sort of the standard military makeup. And when we spoke with the Syrian Women's Council as well, we spoke with the Yazidi community. Each occasion you see these strong, powerful women who have been critical to rebuilding society and rebuilding it on a new model, which I think is honest in some ways to that multicultural history of Syria. Like, Syria has only existed successfully, and administrations in that part of the world have only ever been successful when they have been respectful of the multicultural nature of that part of the world. And they're kind of relearning those lessons, but also with a clear commitment to ecological socialism and an absolutely belief and affirmation in gender equality. And, I think few people in Australia would understand that kind of social and political and economic experiment is playing out in real time.
Now, I'm going to come back to your visit to the Roj camp a little later. I just want to ask you a different question first. Now, as you said, the Democratic Autonomous Administration of North and East Syria and the Syrian Democratic Forces remain committed to negotiating an integration into a new united Syria with the Syrian Transitional Government under President Ahmad al-Sharaa. But that transitional government has not exactly been winning the confidence of minority ethnic and religious groups such as the Kurds, the Druze, and the Alawites. Do you think the Rojava model of pluralistic decentralization does offer some lessons for building a united and democratic Syria?
Well, obviously, I'm an Australian senator. It's not my job to map out what the future of Syria will be. That's for the people of Syria and hopefully their friends around the world to assist. But it's overwhelmingly the task of the people of Syria. Obviously, when we were speaking with people on the ground, there was very real concern about what had happened in Soweto, what had happened to the Druze minority, concerns about, and I've heard them before I left the country as well from our own Syrian Australian community, concerns about the Alawites and other minorities not being safe with the new regime in Damascus. And so that is obviously part of the background in the peace negotiations, and it's in the minds of people when they're trying to work out, well, how far are you willing, what power are you willing to give up, what mechanisms are you willing to enter into as part of a peace negotiation? But, it was very clear to me that there is an absolute commitment in the administration to make those negotiations work, to find a pathway through that keeps a united Syria, but also retains the achievements that have happened in northeast Syria, and to use it as hopefully a model for how to protect minority rights, engage and protect women throughout the rest of Syria. But I didn't get the sense that they had a mind to in any way impose those values. I think that the sense that I was getting was by living those values and showing their success, it becomes a model that people may want to emulate in the rest of Syria. And an absolute commitment to peace, but with a backstop and a firm statement that we're not going to give up all these gains. We're not just going to hand them over. Like, they're important to be defended.
Yes, I think that we've seen how there's been increasing interest, say, among the Druze in Soweto in looking at experience in North and East Syria, in the current terrible situation that they're confronting. But another area where there's been a lot of tension, I was wondering whether anyone brought them up, is the parts of Damascus and Aleppo, which are Kurdish, still Kurdish, have got Kurdish populations, have been placed under considerable pressure in the last few weeks. Did that issue come up at all? I think they've been blockaded effectively.
No, that didn't come up directly in those terms, but it was very clear that the negotiations are ongoing, as good faith as they can be, but also quite tense, and I don't think anyone was pretending otherwise. And if you just laid out all the challenges along the pathway to peace, it would be quite a list. But the fact that you have the administration committed to it, and the fact that there was those set of principles signed, I think, on the 10th of March, which seemed to be a kind of good starting point for an ongoing peace negotiation, and there was multi-party commitment to those principles on the 10th of March. If they can be, a good faith marker for how the peace negotiations, well, I think there is hope. That being said, some of the discussions we had across the board in northeast Syria was that the administration in Damascus was reinterpreting some of what they thought was agreed in those 10th of March principles. But I think no one would suggest that this is easy, and indeed,
clearly it isn't.
Yeah, in some ways, war is a very binary process. You apply violence. There's obviously 2 or 3 sides, and you just aggressively progress that. The harm and the damage is obscene, but there's a certain binary nature to war. But the peace sometimes is harder, and bringing these multiple, competing issues to the table and finding a sustainable peace is harder. And, people were quite frank about how hard the peace building is, but also how committed they are to it.
Now, the other thing that I've heard from political leaders in Rojava and northeast Syria is that the process of negotiating this rebuilding of a new Syria would be difficult enough, but then there's also the intervention of regional powers such as Turkey, Israel, the Gulf states, Iran. What sort of foreign policy should countries like Australia adopt to to make the best of this, to minimize this distortion on, what, would be a wonderful thing, progress towards a negotiated united Syria?
Well, it's pretty clear that Australia largely just follows Washington's call in this space. To the extent that we have a distinct interest in the region, that's often seen through our relationship with Turkey. Sometimes that's coloured by, once-a-year ceremony on the shores of Gallipoli. But that can I think quite often distort Australia's engagement in the region. I mean, obviously we should be friends and engaging with Turkey, and we should be respectful of the history, but we shouldn't allow that to distort our views about what's happening in Syria, or to turn our eye from some of the violence that's been repeatedly inflicted by the Turkish military in northeast Syria. Like, that's real. And of course, Australia, I am, this won't surprise you, Peter, I'm a critic of Australia's continuing permissive attitude towards Israel, whether it's Israel's bombing of targets in Syria, occupation of southern Lebanon, bombing of targets in Beirut, the obscenity of what's happened in Gaza. Australia will so often just, have a sort of benign indifference to Israel's violence and destabilisation in the region. And then, of course, dealing with the new regime in Damascus and being very clear from the outset that, basic human rights are non-negotiable, and the attacks against the Druze, the fear that the Alawites and other minorities are living in, that's not acceptable if you want to be a part of the international community. But for Australia, none of that kind of nuance really is heard. It's very much, well, what does Washington want us to do? We don't want to piss off Israel. No, we need to keep Turkey sweet. And if that comes at a cost of saying nothing about what's happening in Syria, refusing to even acknowledge the gains in northeast Syria, well, then I think they're willing to do that. And I think it's to the long-term disadvantage of peace in the region. Because if you think about the Middle East, right, like literally Syria is in the heart of it. It is the heart of the Middle East. And whilst ever that's in disarray and violence and is the sort of plaything of regional and other powers, we won't be able to have a sustainable peace in the Middle East. And, I think, when I came back, I challenged Penny Wong about, what engagement, if any, they're wishing to make with northeast Syria. And it was a slightly less guarded exchange, but still a very guarded exchange. And I think if many Australians understood what was happening there more clearly, they'd expect our government to take a more, earnest, good faith engagement in it.
Well, one reading of the current situation in which the Syrian, transition, if you like, is taking place is a new Pax Israel, Pax Americana. This is it's horrible, the idea that coming out of this 2-year genocide in Gaza, we have an Israeli state that feels it can freely bomb any of its neighbors and is, right? And you visited Lebanon, right? So, how sustainable is any arrangement for peace and unity anywhere in the region, let alone Syria, in the context of an Israel that is empowered and feels free to bomb anyone in the area?
Well, it's clearly not sustainable. You can't build a bilateral peace or a multilateral peace arrangement where one party feels able to just do routine military assassinations of their neighbours, feels free to ignore international borders and just invade sovereign countries. That was apparent in my discussions in northeast Syria, although probably just because of geography, it wasn't probably at the front of the discussions in northeast Syria. But it was absolutely a core part of the discussions we had later in the trip when we went to Lebanon, because, of course, Israel is still occupying a significant chunk of southern Lebanon. Israel still feels perfectly free to do repeated airstrikes, artillery strikes, tank attacks in southern Lebanon. And of course, they've until very recently, those air attacks were also happening all the way up to Beirut. In the middle of Beirut, you can go past, large parts of city blocks that have been destroyed by Israeli airstrikes. So, it goes without saying that you can't have a sustainable peace process. You can't rebuild the links you need in the region if you've got one rogue state that feels like that they can just invade, assassinate, disrespect any neighbour at any time whenever they choose.
And what's your reading of the Albanese Labor government currently in relation to Israel? I mean, it's done this belated formal recognition of the Palestinian state, but is it still largely all the way with Israel and the USA, do you think?
Apart from that, that moment of recognition, which, of itself makes no material change, although I, support it. Apart from that, you couldn't put you could hardly put a sheet of paper to separate the core policy of the United States as against the core policy of Australia. We continue to feed into global weapons chains, such as the F-35, and feed parts directly into the Israeli military. I think we put 2 sanctions against 2 members of the Netanyahu cabinet, but continue the two-way military trade with Israel. We buy their weapons to give them scale and profit so as they can continue to do the violent, genocide in Gaza and attacks of their neighbours. We buy their weapons when Israel says to us, look, you see, we use them in Gaza, they're very effective. We use them in Yemen, look, they're very effective, you should buy them. And our government says, yep, sure, we'll buy those weapons. I mean, that's blood trade of the first order. And we have no material economic sanctions against Israel, and particularly Israel IT and tech industries. They can have a significant footprint even inside government departments in Australia. So, it is hard to believe that we're now 2 and a bit years into a genocide, and none of those core material structures have been in any way changed in our relationship with Israel. And that's, I think, because Washington wouldn't let us. We're recording this the day after the meeting between Trump and Albanese, and you could see that, Australia has been desperate not to offend Donald Trump, to be as loyal and unquestioning and, an ally or a cat's paw, however you want to describe us, to the United States has been, in order to keep this, bizarre AUKUS project on track, and to satisfy the elites in Canberra who when they see the world, they don't view it with Australian eyes, they view it through a Washington lens.
Now, given the negotiations, still ongoing between northeast Syria and Damascus, are there things that the Australian and other Western governments or international governments could do to break down the almost isolation and cutting off of North and East Syria? Are there steps that can be taken that are still within the framework of international law that are available to the Australian government? And have you put them to the
well, this is
government?
This is a call that we've heard from the Syrian Australian community. I heard it before I left. And then I heard it again on the ground in northeast Syria, which is, will we please lift sanctions, the economic and trade sanctions that we have against Syria? I mentioned that the power infrastructure has been destroyed in northeast Syria. Well, actually, it's been destroyed across Syria. Water and sewage infrastructure has been destroyed. Telecommunications infrastructure has been destroyed. They have to rebuild schools and hospitals and universities, and pretty much all of those key materials are the subject of international sanctions. So, getting a set of solar panels in a township in Syria where they're blessed with vast amounts of sunshine, a solar panel that would cost $20 here costs $100 there because they have to be smuggled in around sanctions. they can't rebuild some of their core water infrastructure because they can't get the parts. Their oil infrastructure, because there's still a significant oil industry in Syria, their oil infrastructure is running on, antiquated, polluting equipment that, I'm a Greens MP. I'm not here to massively promote the world's oil industry, but, oil is going to continue to be a part of the economic makeup for Syria for the, foreseeable future. Allowing some infrastructure in and some investment in to remove the environmental damage and make it a cleaner and more efficient industry, I mean, that should also be part. But, whilst ever the world's got these one-size-fits-all sanctions against Syria, you could understand why people wanted to put sanctions on the Assad regime. I'm not a supporter of broad-based sanctions, economic sanctions like that. I think elites tend to manage to survive, and those broad-based sanctions brutally impact the people with the least in an economy. But lifting those broad-based sanctions against Syria, I think, there's a degree of urgency to it. And they don't all have to be lifted, but those core ones to allow the people of Syria to rebuild Syria, I think should be lifted, urgently. I did raise that with Penny Wong in the Senate estimates the week before last, and there's clearly a willingness within the Australian regime to be part of, a global movement to be lifting sanctions. But that's urgent, Peter, really is.
So just to finish up, let me go back to your visit to the Roj IDP and detention camp in the middle of the desert, which has basically people from the ISIS times, isn't it, and their families. It's not the biggest one. The Al Hol is bigger, I understand.
Yeah, Al Hol,
fairly big. And
yeah.
what's give us an idea of how many people are there, who they are, and what's your impression of the conditions they're in? And of course, what should Australian and other Western governments be doing about this? I mean, this is ridiculous. This has been going on for so many years.
Well, I went into El Roj, which has about 2,500 people in it, all women and children in El Roj. And it's quite separate from El Haj, the one which has about 40,000 majority men in that. So El Roj is only women and children. And I went there because there's 37 Australians in detention, 25 children, and 12 of their mums in El Roj. So you literally drive through the desert, very dry. The hillside has a kind of small oil refinery near it. I'm told that can create significant pollution impacts inside it. But you drive in, there's very high security around the outside. We met the team doing the security outside, again, women, militia, you wouldn't mess with, I've got to tell you, providing the external security. And then we met with the administration inside again. The only administration officials we dealt with were all women. And what the administration officials said to us is, well, we're a very poor country in northeast Syria. You can see we're trying to rebuild from a civil war. You can see we're dealing with drought. You can see all the economic challenges we have. And yet you're insisting that we look after your own children and look after their mums. And this should be Australia's responsibility. Australia should take your children back, and with your vastly greater amount of wealth, your vastly greater resources, you should, work to safely reintegrate them into your society. And if you have security concerns, you deal with your security concerns as you best see fit. But these are your women, these are your children. Why are you making us continue to run this detention camp? And my understanding is the United States has been quietly putting some pressure on Australia as well to do that. And you've got to say that's a pretty compelling position for the northeast Syrian regime to do. We then met with 3 of the women and one of the children, a little 6-year-old girl, her mum and 2 of her aunts, as it turns out. One biological, I think, one nominal. The women had all come to Syria when they were incredibly young, 17, 18, 19. This little girl had been born in the camp, actually, so she'd never known anything other than the camp. And the camp is very dry. It's tense. It has rudimentary schooling, very rudimentary schooling provided by NGOs. They try and do the best they can, but they don't have the resources, so they provide, short periods of rudimentary schooling. The Australians, we were told by both the administration and also when we met with the Australians, very much keep to themselves. There's Australia Street apparently, and it just has the Australians in it, and they keep to themselves. And the administration said, well, the Australians, they have indicated for years their intention is to return to Australia. They don't want any part of what was happening before in ISIS and that regime. They want to go back. They want to reintegrate into Australia. They want to do that collaboratively with the government, and they want their kids to have, home in Australia. And that was the same that we heard directly from the women themselves. They'd come very young. They'd had this, they've been in the detention camp now for about 7 years. That Australian officials had visited at the end, towards the middle and the end of 2022. Everyone had their biometrics taken, all of the necessary information given so they could all be issued with passports. ASIO apparently came in and did an assessment and said there was no ASIO-based barrier for them to be returned to Australia. There was a hope that they would be returned to Australia at the end of 2022, but only about a third of them actually came home at that time. The rest have been then just told nothing. No further communication from their government, no further timetable, absolutely nothing since the end of 2022. That is, you can imagine how distressing that is. Mm. I mean, no one's saying that, people haven't made very bad choices. Some people have, some of these women have made very bad choices. They were very young women in a structure where women had minimal, if any, power. Mm. But, at the core of it for me are the kids, 25 kids, Australian kids. None of them had agency in any of this. None of them chose to be in Syria. None of them, should be being punished in the way they are, with their entire lives being absolutely, placed not just on hold, but put in really brutal conditions. And we should be bringing our kids home. That should be a clear obligation of the Australian government. If you bring the kids home, you have to bring their mums home. And we should ensure that that's done collaboratively with our security agencies, that any risks are absolutely fully assessed, that people need to be the subject of ongoing monitoring. Of course, that should happen. But for the kids, we should be trying to bring them in and reintegrate them and make them, positive, strong parts of the Australian community as soon as possible. This little girl, she was born in the camp, right? Little 6-year-old girl. She spoke with the broadest possible Australian accent. I could have been having a chat with her in Burwood, except for outside was a desert and tents and razor wire. The women obviously are trying to do the best they can for their kids and doing things that would break your heart, really, because the schooling is so rudimentary. The women have been drawing their own lesson plans up and, trying to remember from their own study, what the digestive tract looks like or what geography looks like, what the body parts are called, some basic maths questions, hand-drawn lesson plans, because none of that is being taught in the school, and they just want the best for their kids and they want their kids to have a future. Those kind of small things, when you see them directly in front of you in a place like that, it is heartbreaking. And I think our government has shown absolutely no courage and no decency by refusing in any way to help these Australian children come home. And of course they should.
Well, thank you, David. I think you would be the first Australian politician to visit North and East Syria. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely.
So will you be urging other politicians to perhaps go across and see for themselves? I mean, there have been visitors from MPs from Europe.
There are multiple
other parts of the world.
Delegations from Europe have visited. Yes. As we were leaving, a delegation from South Africa was coming into the region. There have been delegations from South America, from North America, and what we've done in many ways is proof test this, right? So I would say to any Australian politician who cares about what the pathway to peace in the Middle East, who wants to sort of go beyond the two-dimensional headlines that you hear about this, to engage. We're happy to help, put people in contact with the administration and with people on the ground to go and see for themselves and hopefully join the voice for a far more nuanced approach to the region, to have Australia approach it with Australian eyes, not Washington's eyes, and also perhaps to join with us and groups like Save the Children and be an advocate so that the Australian government brings these Australian kids home so they can be safe.
Thank you, Senator David Shoebridge.
Thanks, Peter.
Thanks to Peter and David. That brings us to the end of the Green Left show today. As I said at the beginning, please remember you can become a Green Left supporter if you're not already. It is the number one way to support our work. But even without spending a cent, you can help us out by sharing this video or podcast, giving it a thumbs up or a 5-star review. Help spread the audience for the Green Left show, and we will see you next time.